Hi everybody, and you're welcome to this edition of Capricorn Radio, broadcasting today from the town of Malmo in southern Sweden. Our aim here is to discuss topical science, ancient history and historical mysteries in an effort to unveil our true cultural blueprint. If you haven't checked out our website yet, you can log on to capricornradio.com and there you can subscribe for our show releases and news updates. You can also follow the links on the homepage for the YouTube channel and the subscriptions. All the shows will be archived there and they're all accessible from the homepage, and feel free to get in touch. You know, I've been off the airwaves for a week or more now doing some travel research and writing, and I'm delighted to be back today with today's guest. I have a personal interest in the Dogon tribe, and today we'll be discussing the work of Laird Scranton. He has devoted a large chunk of his time to academic research of the Dogon. Laird Scranton is a software designer from Albany in New York, and he's the author of 2 books on African and Egyptian cosmology and language. His focus is on the study of comparative cosmology, which is the study of the classic myths, symbols, deities, cosmological concepts, rituals, and words of various ancient and modern cultures. He's also had a more recent book on the Velikovsky heresies, which I believe we're going to do a split show today on. So hour 1 will be on the Dogon and hour 2 on the Velikovsky heresies, all being well. So let's see, can we get our guest on the line? So I have with me now on the line Laird Scranton, author of a trilogy of books containing Dogon material and symbology. They are namely Science of the Dogon, Sacred Symbols of the Dogon, and the Cosmological Origins of Myth and Symbol. His latest work is also the Velikovsky heresies, which we're going to get into in the second half of the show. So without further delay, let's bring on our guest for today. Hi Laird, welcome to Capricorn Radio.
Hey James, thank you very much for having me on.
Well, it's my pleasure, Laird. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Is it Laird?
Yes, absolutely.
It's
that's
very
right.
Unusual name.
You're one of the few who gets it right.
Right, okay. Well, I didn't want to mispronounce it because I know we've got some funny names over here too. So I've never come across a Laird before. So
actually, I've never come face to face with one either.
Really? Okay, look, you know, having read your work, Laird, you know, which I firstly commend you on, I really thoroughly enjoyed it, and thank you for writing those books because I got such pleasure out of them.
Oh, well, thank you. Nice of you to say that.
Yeah, well, you know, and again, you know, look, I really see the unique skill set that you bring to the table, you know, and I get people that are in the field of Egyptology or history or archaeology come on the show, and then I've got people that are outside, and the ones that are outside are the ones that are interesting because they bring a different skill set. But and it's okay for me because I've read your books. But just for the listeners, Laird, could you give us a bit about your background, your career, and how, and tell us why this is important to the research that we're going to talk about today?
Okay, well, I had a very liberal education in Oregon on the west coast of the United States, and ended up being one of the first male co-eds at Vassar College, which was the first all-women's college in the United States. Mm-hmm. I then was trained to be a computer programmer at Vassar, and then became an independent software designer once I graduated college, mm-hmm. and spent many years working for a wide range of companies writing custom software, and then became interested in ancient mysteries when my wife gave me a book about various mysteries. Right.
Interesting. So you've really applied your computer software and programming skills for the symbology that we're going to talk about today with your Dogon material. Is that correct?
That's right. The computer background gave me a professional perspective from which I could see that I could recognize what look like design symbols as opposed to symbols that are just fortuitous.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, you've been able to dispel what's abstract. I think people think of the symbols that we're going to talk about as abstract and just fanciful or artistic, but there's quite a very defined, specific technical meaning to a lot of these, or you believe so anyway, which I think you portray.
Yes, I would say that one of the biggest detriments to a person who's doing research like I'm doing is their own wishfulness. Mm-hmm. And it's a problem how to protect yourself from your own wishfulness. And so when I work with interpretations of symbols or myths or whatever, I try to begin with explicit statements on the part of the culture that I've studied. so that I know that I'm on a firm ground. It's not that I want to believe that a symbol means such and such. I have at least one culture and one cross-confirming reference to show that in ancient times they considered these symbols to mean certain things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay, so look, we're going to talk about the Dogon today, and their symbology, and it's quite a complex history stroke mythology. I don't know what to call it. I like to call it history because to the people of the Dogon in West Africa, it's history to them. It's their real living history. But a lot of people refer to it as their mythology, which I don't like to call it that. But so I guess just kind of maybe define the Dogon for us, and a bit of their geographics and their history for us, Laird.
Okay, the Dogon are a modern-day African tribe involving approximately 300,000 individuals right now who are from Mali in Africa, which is in northwest Africa in the large bulge at the top of Africa. Mm-hmm. And they are a priestly tribe who deliberately located themselves far distant from other contacts. They live an 8-hour drive across desert from the nearest large civilized place. And their priests retain a very clear sense of what their symbols and their myths mean, which makes them a good group to work with. They also represent a kind of crossroads of several important ancient traditions. For example, they have rituals similar to Judaism. They wear skull caps and prayer shawls. They circumcise and they celebrate a jubilee year. But they also have civic traditions that are very similar to ancient Egypt. And they have a cosmology that's a very close match for ancient Buddhism. So all of this makes the Dogon a very interesting and fertile ground to explore for what the possible meanings of these myths and symbols might have been.
Sure. Just on a time frame, just because I know there was Dogon masks that they're able to date. Is that correct? They found, or they have these Dogon masks that are made every, is it 50, 60 years?
That's right.
And they're able to add them up or something like that, Laird. I think that's what I'm getting at.
Yes, the Dogons celebrate an important festival that's related to the stars of Sirius. Right. They say every 60 years, but in fact, they find an excuse to celebrate it every 50 years. There's a deliberate obfuscation going on there to try to hide an important calculation in their tradition.
Right. I'm glad you mentioned that because I've had conflicting reports about the 60 and the 50, and that's why I said to you, was it 60? So, interesting.
Yes. Officially, the outward statement is it's every 60 years, but no individual in their tribe lives long enough to notice, that there have been more than two that are 50 years apart. If they see two in 50 years, they consider it an exception. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But yes, with every one of these festivals are called the Sigi Festival, S-I-G-I.
Yeah.
They make a mask that gets put away in a cave for storage, and they can count these masks back many units of 50 years back. And so that gives them an idea of how long the Dogon tradition itself has been practiced.
Yeah, and that's just in the region in Western Africa, in the Mali region. Is that correct, where they're at now?
That's right. They live along a large escarpment in the desert. They eke out a very meager living, but they're also craftspeople and artisans who make they carve statues, and they make a living through their artwork also.
Yeah, I've seen some pictures of the escarpments, and it looks pretty gruesome where they're at, Laird.
Yes, it's pretty interesting. And these escarpments are filled with caves, and the caves are utilized as part of their ritual.
Right. Okay, so these guys are in Western Mali, and anybody that's going to do Dogon research, which not a lot of people will pick up the research that the two French anthropologists did, and you couldn't probably count it on your left hand a handful of authors that have really done this. So I guess what grabbed your attention first and foremost, and probably bring in the two French anthropologists, because that's where the research kind of starts for you, Laird, if that's right.
That's right. My wife in the early 1990s gave me a book called Unexplained by Jerome Clark. Mm-hmm. And this book consists of a number of chapters that each deal with an unresolved mystery in the world. And one of the chapters was devoted to the Dogon. And when I read it, the description was about a tribe that seemed to know some things about astronomy, and in particular about the stars of Sirius, that they shouldn't be able to know without the aid of modern telescopes. And so I thought, well, however this turns out, this looks like a very interesting area to look into, and I began following sources. I read Robert Temple's book called The Sirius Mystery, and I used his bibliography as a foothold into other resources to explore about the Dogon. Mm-hmm. Now, the main source is the study done by the French anthropologists Marcel Griol and Germaine Dieterlen, who studied and worked with the Dogon over a course of 30 years from 1930s through 1956, when Griol died suddenly. Sure. And that produced a number of articles and a couple of important books, including a final study on the Dogon religion called The Pale Fox.
Right.
And also Griol's daughter, Genevieve Calumet Griol, who is also a well-respected French anthropologist in her own right. She's in her late 80s right now and lives in Paris, wrote the Dogon Dictionary, which is also a very important resource.
Yeah, that's something I hadn't come across till I read your work, that there was actually a Dogon dictionary, because I wondered how people could pick up the researches and were they just relying on books, but that must be very important for the Dogon. And indeed, the two French anthropologists, I mean, it's very important that they actually went and did that. They were living with them a long time, and that's so significant for that religion stroke mythology to survive, I think, Laird.
Yes, and at the time, Griol was the foremost, considered the foremost anthropologist in Europe. And he was very innovative about his techniques. He was the first person to use film as part of his study, his anthropological studies.
Oh, right.
So he was not just any run-of-the-mill anthropologist. He was a very well-known personage.
Yeah. Where's the footage at now, Laird? Have you seen any of that footage, or?
You can find some of it on on YouTube, and there are DVDs you can buy on the internet. In Search of the Pale Fox is one of the documentaries that was produced based on Griol's footage.
Right. Excellent. I'm going to look that up. So you mentioned the Sirius Mystery there, because I guess Robert Temple popularized the Sirius Mystery. You know, you're a little bit older than me. I won't say how old, but I would have been a kid when that came out. But I mean, what impact did that have at the time when it came out, I think, Laird? Or was that largely kind of escaped the radar at the time, or?
No, actually, it was a very popular book. As a matter of fact, it was published by Inner Traditions, which is also my publisher.
Oh, that's your publisher, yes. I've seen that.
And for many years was the best-selling book they had. And part of the reason they acquired my books was as a way of supporting the sales of that book.
All right. Fascinating. Okay, so let's get into some of the... I want to throw out some of the Dogon material before we get into your interpretation and your research. Just give us a little bit of the creation story of the Dogon, I think, probably just for the listeners.
Okay, to give you some background,
yeah.
the Dogon have an esoteric tradition, a lot like many ancient cultures had, and there's very specific rules to this tradition. If I'm an initiate and you're a priest, and I ask you a question that is appropriate to my initiated status, you're required to give me a truthful answer. Mm-hmm. But if I ask you a question that is somehow inappropriate to my status, you're required either to remain silent or to lie if you have to in order to protect secrets of the tradition.
Right.
Now, Griol described this very clearly in his works, and it comes into play because a few years later, when after Robert Temple's book made the Dogon very controversial, because Temple was claiming that the Dogon evidence pointed to an alien contact.
Yeah.
And so suddenly the Dogon became controversial, and another team was sent to research the Dogon, a team of anthropologists headed by Belgian Walter van Beek.
Sure, I'm going to get into him a little later. I'm glad you brought him up. So, Germaine and Dieterlen, they went there. They didn't just walk in there and were revealed all the secrets of the Dogon, basically. Then, if that's the case, if it was an esoteric mystery religion with initiates and asking the right questions, how come they got to know the knowledge? I suppose, Laird.
Well, first of all, it's a question of time. It's a lot like the stories you hear of Greek philosophers who spent 20 years in Egypt studying with priests.
Mm-hmm.
This is a 2-decade process that it
Right.
takes to come up with this information. And Griol's nature was to ask penetrating questions. He wasn't satisfied not knowing. And so he would persist in asking the next question and following up on the previous question. And over a period of time, he finally reached a point where the questions he was asking were touching on secret aspects of the tradition. And one of the priests who was working with him, the Dogon priests, decided to check with a tribal council, because the rule of the Dogon tribe is that anyone who asks the question should get the answer, not
Right.
just a tribe member.
Oh.
And so
I see.
the priest went to the tribal council to say, now, the way I understand it here, anyone who asks is supposed to be answered. What about this French anthropologist?
Mm-hmm.
And the council said absolutely yes. If he's asking the question, he deserves the answer. And so they decided to initiate him as if he were a tribal member. As a matter of fact, when he died in 1956, he was given a burial as if he were a Dogon tribe member.
Really? Fascinating.
And he became an insider in the Dogon tradition.
Mm-hmm. So I guess his persistence paid off in the end, Ard.
Yes, considering that was what he wanted to learn about, his persistence did, but it was a very long process.
Right. Okay, so before we get into details of the astronomy stuff, and I know Robert Temple's work was controversial because he ran with the pink elephant in the room scenario, if you want to call it that. But this guy, Walter van Beek, this guy, the Belgian guy that went in then did he go in with the attitude to disprove the Robert Temple book, or did he go in with preconceived notions? I'm trying to build a picture here, Laird. Did he go with the same? Did he go in with the same approach as Jermaine Dieter, perhaps? Then is that a better way?
That's very hard to say, and I don't know Van Beek personally, but I know that his background was as an ecologist. His background was not in ancient religion or in the anthropological study of religion. Right. So it seemed like an odd choice to have him head a team that was going in to restudy religion. The other odd thing is that it's fairly common in the anthropological world for a second anthropologist to restudy some aspect of another anthropologist's work.
Right.
But Van Beek was proposing to restudy the life's work of Marcel Griol, only he was only planning on spending a few years, devoting a few years' time to it rather than decades.
Right. So that was my next question. And how long did Van Beek spend there? Which is probably a lot less than Jermaine or Dieterlen.
Yes, he only spent a few years there. And after interviewing, I think he did a very thorough job of trying to interview people, and I think he was honest about the answers that he received from tribes members and priests and so forth. But Griol had made it very clear in his study that anyone who comes in from the outside asking leading questions is going to be met with silence.
Yeah, because that's what you were saying about the initiation and the questioning process.
So the comparison I use to what Van Beek did is to a person who goes to a college campus on Parents' Weekend and comes away having seen no evidence of drug and alcohol use.
Very good. Yeah, I like that. Yeah. You get a clear picture there.
So Van Beek came away and said, look, I can't recreate any of the findings of Griol. As far as I'm concerned, initially Van Beek was saying that the Dogon priests invented their cosmology as a way to answer questions that Griol was making, that Griol was too persistent in his inquiries.
Yeah.
Later on, Van Beek was suggesting that the central symbol of the Dogon cosmology was a symbol that was only known to Griol. So he was implying that Griol had either perpetrated a fraud or had somehow misinterpreted a symbol.
Right.
And this opinion was put forth in the mid-1980s, the late 1980s by Van Beek, and stood for 20 years, or 15 or 20 years.
Sure. I actually read the paper on Van Beek. You can get it free online, but I didn't. It's not that I disliked it. I just felt there was an effort to dispel some information, when not an effort to find out the true sense of the information. That's the essence I got from it, anyway.
So one of the difficulties I faced was, how do you establish in any believable way that real study is a legitimate source to be working from?
Right, right.
Well, I was very fortunate in that my daughter, who was a college student at the time, made a visit to India. She was working with the Himalayan Health Exchange in India. And when she came back from India, she mentioned to me that she had noticed all across India examples of ritual shrines that looked a lot like an important shrine that the Dogon built.
Right.
The shrine is called the stupa.
The stupa, yes.
Okay, so I stopped my daughter at that point and I said, before you tell me any more about what you saw, I'm going to make a half a dozen predictions for you of what the symbolism of the stupa is based on what I know about the Dogon, and you and I are going to sit at the computer and we're going to verify each point.
Clever, very clever.
And so we did. We sat down and we were able to demonstrate that all of these key points of symbolism that relate to the stupa, to the Dogon Alliance shrine, also relate to the stupa.
Fascinating.
Okay. From there, I then purchased a book called The Symbolism of the Stupa, which was written by a professor by the name of Adrian Snodgrass. He works with the University of West Sydney, Australia, and he's considered to be the world's leading authority on Buddhist architecture and symbolism. And it turns out that the book that he wrote in the 1980s describes a cosmology associated with the Buddhist stupa that is a point-for-point match for what Griot described in connection with the ritual shrine of the Dogon.
Fascinating. So this is
now,
this couldn't be made up then, is
right.
The point.
Since the Buddhist system is an acknowledged system and a legitimate system, that first of all, the Dogon priests could not have casually invented Buddhism.
Yeah.
And second of all, we have a model now to compare what Griot said, and point by point by point, he's right. He's describing a real cosmology.
I can get your mindset there too, Laird, that you want to trust the evidence, you want to trust where you're going with this, and when you get a lock on the evidence, you get another wind, you get a second wind to go again and pursue details then as never before.
Now, and a very similar thing happened when Robert Temple's book came out, and he claimed that the Dogon had knowledge that was ancient knowledge that reflected information about astronomy they shouldn't know.
Sure.
Carl Sagan stepped up and said, well, yes, they have information here that is very advanced scientific knowledge, but it seems far more likely that a modern visitor met with the Dogon and gave them that information rather than that they got it in ancient times.
Sure.
And how do you disprove that?
Yeah.
Well, as it turns out, each of the important terms that are used in Dogon cosmology happens to be an ancient Egyptian word. These terms, for a linguist, most linguists will tell you that if you have two words have a word that is the same in two different languages that carries the same meaning, that is not enough evidence to validate that there's a relationship between the words, because there are too few phonetic values and too much possibility of coincidence. Mm-hmm. But in the case of the Dogon system of cosmology and the Buddhist system, every term is given at least two meanings, and those meanings are distinct from one another. They're logically separated in such a way that simply knowing one won't allow you to guess the second one.
Right.
So now when we go to the Egyptian Hieroglyphic Dictionary and we find words pronounced like the Dogon word carrying those same meanings, we have a lock-on relationship.
Right. So you got two distinctive meanings that can't be related anyway, which defines the evidence that you're looking for, basically.
Right. Now, that would be great if it were just one word, but what we actually have is an entire system of words in the Dogon cosmology that are matches for an entire system of words in the Egyptian Hieroglyphic Dictionary that all work the same way. They carry multiple distinct meanings that you can match up. Mm-hmm. Now, furthermore, we're fortunate that in the case of the Dogon, the language appears to be ancient Egyptian language. But when you go to Buddhism, you're comparing two different cultures. In Buddhism, the words are given based likely on Sanskrit, not on the ancient Egyptian language. But it's the case with the cosmology that any concept that carries these multiple terms carries forward across cultures and across languages. So it doesn't matter what it's called in Sanskrit. The word's going to carry the same set of meanings that the Dogon give to the word.
Sure. And let's give some background for the listeners here. Their key concepts involve weaving and farming and metallurgy and everyday things, but again, two random concepts stuck together for a word or with distinctive meanings, yeah?
That's right. I mean, a very good example of this is the Dogon have a creator god whose name is Amma.
Yes.
Okay. There are reasons based on mythology and the position of Amma within the system of mythology and actions Amma performs and icons he's associated with and so forth to compare Amma to Amen in Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the term Amma refers to a hidden god, but it can also mean to grasp, to hold firm, or to establish.
Mm-hmm.
When you go to the Egyptian hieroglyphic language, you find that the word Amen refers to a hidden god, but it also means to grasp, to hold firm, or to establish.
Right.
For that matter, if you go to the word Amen in Judaism, where the belief is that there's no relation whatsoever to the Egyptian god Amen, the Hebrew word comes from a root that means to establish.
Fascinating.
So these words of the cosmology become a very important tool in being able to align one system to another.
Sure. So I'm guessing, Lard, you get to a point where you're getting your interest aroused with these locks on these double meanings and being corroborated time and time again. At what point does this cascade for you and you realize you're knee deep in research and there's something really complex going on?
Actually, the point where it did that, I was keeping notes for myself,
right,
trying to keep them organized. I had no intention of ever writing a book.
Right.
And I realized after a few months that I had enough material to write an article if I wanted to.
Okay.
And after a period of several years, I realized I had enough material for my first book, and it was already fairly written for me because I had kept it organized.
Mm-hmm.
And so I self-published the first book. That book, it was published under the title Hidden Meanings. And then that book found its way to John Anthony West, the Egyptologist,
sure,
who, as it turns out, lives not very far from me, and he took that book and the manuscript for a second book to New York to a publishing fair and personally shopped publishers for the books.
Yeah, he's a nice guy, John, and I know that story just as I heard that one before from another show. But yeah, I mean, John Anthony West, you definitely speak very highly of him, Lard. You know,
I do. I mean, actually, I've told that story before to close friends of John's, and one in particular I was talking to explained to him, and I said, "This just demonstrates what a wonderful, supportive guy John always is." Mm-hmm. And his friend said, "John's not always that way with people." He was very surprised. Actually, John is. John is a very well-known and well-liked and well-respected.
He is very well-known and very well-liked. I definitely agree with that. You know, that's actually where I first came across your work, Laird, was on the Magical Egypt DVD series, which I adore. I would watch it over and over. And
that footage was filmed the first day that John invited my wife and me to his house to meet him.
Really?
Yes. Good. I arrived not realizing that he had a cameraman on the scene, and he filmed our first get-together.
He pounced on you. Very good. Well, listen, you know, you can forgive me for not reading your work because you've done a bit of footage and you spoke at a good few conferences and, you know, to get your work out there. But I'm going to get into some of your actual specific research because you really just interpreted the symbols in a different way, I think, Lords. You know, and it is a very complex, let me just say this, it's a very complex mythology stroke, history stroke, religion that these guys have, these Dogon people in Africa. But, I mean, as you describe in your book, you know, they're describing anthropology, botany, zoology, geology, astronomy, physiology, anatomy, you know, and they're doing it that you could point for point, as you say in the book, it's almost like an encyclopedia article. It's not a fanciful interpretation I'm trying to get at here, Laird, yeah?
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's true. I mean, each piece of it is based on explicit statements by the Dogon priests. And I found that the best way to demonstrate the truth of it was simply to lay the Dogon statement side by side with the statement from a modern scientist.
Yeah.
And maybe the Dogon drawing that goes with the statement side by side with the diagram of the scientist. And let the reader read both.
Yeah. And that's what I remember just on the Magical DVD series was the electron cloud diagram, because I've done quantum physics and I've sat through the boring maths and I know it in detail. But, it's actually frightening in terms, because once you realize the point for point, and we'll get into some of these examples, but once you realize the point for point similarity and how complex something is, that it's so similar but still very complex, you go, oh, hang on, there's some truth behind this that we've lost. And then you go, how high was civilization in the past? That's where you kind of head with this.
That's one of the places to go with it.
Yeah.
Now, I came to understand that the Dogon priests said that their creation tradition described how their tribal god, Amma, created matter. And I could see that they had the definition of an atom right, and they had definitions of protons, neutrons, and electrons right, and they even had the drawing of the electron orbit. And so I was not very familiar at that point in time with the structure of matter itself, but I asked myself, if they have these two top-level structures right, what are the chances that all of the descending levels they discuss are also right? And so I began educating myself about that, of string theory and torsion theory and concepts of matter, to try to be able to sort out whether what the Dogon were saying really made any sense.
Sure. Maybe let's just talk about the electron cloud diagram and the Cenacede, because basically the electron cloud diagram would have quadrants of a grid line with quadrants with kind of oval shapes in each quadrant. Would that be kind of way to describe it?
Yes, they're like petals of a flower coming out. If you were to draw an axis,
yes,
and petals of a flower, four petals, one in each quadrant, you would have it.
Yeah, now that's a very distinctive image there, and as soon as I seen that on the Magical DVD, I went, really? Now that's what really grabbed my attention, Lara, that you're onto something here. Definitely.
Now, what's also interesting is that these images are, at the top level of matter, are things we can actually see. We can use an electron microscope to take a picture of this thing, and we know that this is what it really looks like. Now, in the Buddhist tradition, they call that kind of a symbol an adequate symbol.
Right.
It's a symbol that, even if the trail of meaning is lost to the long chain of initiates over time, the symbol still can't lose its meaning because it represents something that's real.
Right.
That we could see.
You can always retrace it or get the information back again, I guess.
Right. And so that's one place to start with these symbols, is with the ones that you could actually see in nature.
Fascinating. Tell me about the Dogon parallels to the Big Bang and the light cones. I just remember reading this in the book, and I kind of went back to light cones, and I know how important they are, but they're just head bending with the mathematics. But they do have Dogon parallels to the Big Bang and light cones. You can see it in their symbology.
Yes, well, one very interesting thing about the Dogon system to me is that they talk about concepts that the astronomers and the astrophysicists are not really ready to talk about yet. For example, astronomers will talk about the Big Bang, but they very rarely talk about what might have existed prior to the Big Bang.
Yeah, it's a tiptoeing subject. They don't really know, and they don't really want to go there and have lack of answers or obscure answers, I guess. But
the Dogon priests come out and they say, well, I can tell you about that. Here, before the Big Bang, they consider that there were what they describe might be comparable to two facing black holes that were both feeding matter toward each other.
Right.
But that the gravitational effects of the black holes were enough to hold that matter in stasis for a long period of time, and that set of matter started spinning faster and faster and faster and faster, and eventually reached a point where the mass of the spinning matter was enough to break the grip of the gravity that was holding in place, and that's when the Big Bang happened.
Fascinating. Tell me about some quantum theory parallels then, because they talk in wave-particle duality, where that's probably something that quantum physics is a little bit more popular these days in terms of scientific documentaries on the telly. I think people understand the particles and the waves, but this is something the Dogon talk about as well.
Yes. It's hard to conceptualize some of this. But one way to put it into context is, you understand, Einstein said that the faster your acceleration is, or the more your mass is, the more time frame slows down.
Mm-hmm.
And so astronauts who are moving in a spaceship, moving away from us very quickly, in the time it takes them to take a sip of their cup of coffee in the morning, we might experience our entire day. Time has slowed down somewhat for them. Well, when we're dealing with concepts of matter that are very, very, very small, the smaller you get, the faster the time frame should be if Einstein's right.
Yeah, because the speeds are quicker, the speeds are faster. So
right, so now if you imagine yourself looking at a film, an aerial view of film of traffic in a large city.
Yes.
And you speed that film up, it eventually reaches a point where you no longer see the individual cars, you see the waves.
Yes.
Okay, that's how matter works according to the Dogen descriptions. And in the Dogen view, what we see in our world is just they call it a reflection or an image of a more fundamental underlying structure. Now, the way that I compare that is if you think about television waves, when television is broadcast through the air, it exists in the form of waves until your receiver or antenna receives it and converts it into an image that you see. And the image that you see is a correct reflection of the thing that they took a picture of on the other end before they converted it into waves.
Yeah.
Okay, so according to the Dogen, that's how matter works, that it actually exists in the form of waves, like a television program exists in the form of waves, but that there's a process that goes through that transforms that into an image for us.
Fascinating.
Now in quantum theory, the conventional theory thinking right now is that there's a point in that process where matter is random. This came out of Heisenberg. Heisenberg.
The uncertainty principle.
The uncertainty principle. But if you think about it, all that's really happening with the uncertainty principle is that you reach a point where the particles that you are observing are so very small that we simply don't have a tool fine enough to detect it without disturbing it.
Yeah.
It's not that it's impossible to detect it without disturbing it. It's that we don't have the tools yet to do it.
We just don't have the method to do that, yeah.
Right. Now, if you imagine that events are transpiring very, very, very quickly at the bottom of matter that way, they may be happening so quickly that we don't have a tool refined enough to be able to predict what the result's going to be. Mm-hmm. And so we make some kind of an inquiry into a system of matter, and we see a result, and it looks random to us because we don't have a fine enough tool to measure it. Mm-hmm. So it's quite possible that matter looks random to astronomers, but in fact is regular.
Sure. I think some physicists could really take a leaf out of some of the Dogon's material, take a leaf out of their book, as such.
That's part of my justification for writing about this. I went through a period of time where I thought, well, look, if someone went to all the trouble over all these centuries to keep this information secret, what right do I have to write about it?
Sure.
But I looked at the system of science they put together and realized that we're only 50 or 100 years behind some of the concepts that the Dogen are talking about. So that if the original intention of whoever put this together was that we should benefit from it, we're almost out of time to do that.
Sure. Niels Bohr, he literally, he was the one to embody this statement, but he said, if you think you understand quantum physics, then you don't. And that's what the first thing you learn when you go to university to study physics and astronomy and quantum physics. But basically what they mean by that is quantum physics is the most successful theory, but that they mean that in terms of being able to apply it to engineering. I mean, they don't understand it. They just know that the math works. Yeah, it's like having a car. You could draw the car. You can say it goes to A to B. You can model it with mathematics. You can say it's got velocity, it's got acceleration, it gets there in X amount of meters in so much time. But at the end of the day, it doesn't tell you how the engine works. It doesn't tell you how the internal actions of the drivers mechanically propelling the car forward. You don't know anything about the inside of the vehicle. You just know that you can model it. And basically that's really what quantum physics is. Now, a lot of people think that quantum physics is kind of mysterious, or it's very well known, and physicists are these great intellectual beings. Now, I'm not taking away from physicists. I've done a physics with astronomy degree, and I just hated the level of maths, but it's somewhat off-putting, and it's somewhat not as understood as people think.
That's true.
Yeah.
One of the nice thing about the conferences that I speak at is they tend to draw a mix of people who are from very fringe researchers to very mainstream academic researchers. Mm-hmm. And one of the people who I came in contact with at one of the conferences is a well-known physicist, and whose attention I had tried all weekend to get his attention to talk about my books, but he was not in a frame of mind to hear it. He was having some personal issues that day, and I just couldn't get any of his attention. Right. Finally, the last day of the conference, my wife and I managed to corner him in the lobby of the hotel, and I gave him the 3-minute summary of my first couple of books.
Right.
And he said, "Do you mean to tell me that? Are you saying that ancient cosmology is science?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "I've been waiting for 30 years for someone to say that to me." And he took the manuscript of my upcoming book and the couple of books I had already published with him back to his home and studied them very carefully and wrote me back and said, whoever put this system together knew what they were talking about. And really? By the way, it represents something, it's closest to a representation of what's called torsion theory. Now, the difference between string theory and torsion theory is primarily in how they model gravity.
Yes.
That in torsion theory, at every point in space-time, you've got a very tiny little vortex that's postulated to exist, whose effect, the cumulative effect of those little vortices is to create gravity. Mm-hmm. And the Dogen system describes those little vortices. So I have fairly good confidence that the structure that the Dogen put together is a realistic representation of the science.
You've just answered the question for me. I guess I'll ask it anyway. But I was going to say, what's the acceptance or what's the view of your work that you've wrote about the Dogon and symbology? But I guess the physicists is the guys that you want to know what they make of it. Basically, I would say, Laird. Is that correct? Well,
they are, to the extent that I want to understand that I am really on a correct track here, one that is not considered to be complete nonsense by someone who's in the field.
Oh, you definitely are on the right track, Laird, without a doubt.
But the truth of the matter is that this community of authors that we have, of emerging authors who are writing about all these ancient mysteries, mm-hmm. have attained their own momentum.
Yes.
To the point where discoveries that are being made about places like ancient Egypt and Göbekli Tepe and so forth are going to go forward regardless of whether the academics really want to approve it or not.
Yeah.
And so it becomes a moot point as to whether the academic wants to listen or not.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, you know, I can see you're probably a little bit different because there's a lot of science and complexity involved in this. But then again, on the other hand, you can't make this up, and the Dogon couldn't make this up because it's so complex and it matches on so many different levels. It is beautiful to kind of see and look at and understand once you get there and once you get into the research.
And what's nice is that I've now reached a point where there are enough distinct different methods of validating any given piece of this mm-hmm. that I could hardly imagine how it could be wrong, because there just isn't wiggle room for it to be wrong. There are too many other things that would also have to be wrong.
Correct. You know, it's such a complex web of science, art, and humanity rolled into this little package, if you want to call it that. And the Dogon have basically protected this knowledge for mankind. That's really their purpose, and I like the way you go into that in the book as well, Laird, where you say that, you know, it's probably a source religion or history, and that they left ancient Egypt most likely in 3500 BC to put a time frame on it, roughly. And they took as an oral culture, and ancient Egypt probably took it as a written symbology culture. Would that be fair to say?
It looks like the connection between the Dogon and the Egyptians happened before the advent of writing in Egypt, which is very, very early on.
Yeah.
And there seems to have been a tradition in Egypt and in some of the other ancient cultures where every so often they would deliberately send a group of priests out into the wilderness to deliberately locate themselves somewhere far, far away from everybody else, almost as a way of making a backup copy of their tradition. And so you see that the Dogon seem to represent one of those tribes. And there's a tribe called the Naki who live in the very inhospitable borderland between Tibet and China that seem to be a tribe like that.
Right.
And even the Hopi Indians in North America have the same tradition of sending priests out to relocate themselves. So that's one of the signatures of the cosmology. What I've done in my third book is try to spell out what I consider to be these signature signs of the tradition. And what I mean by that is that if you find one of these things in a culture you've never studied, it's a very good indicator that they had all the rest of the tradition too originally.
Mm-hmm. And that's in your, I think it's your third book that you try to synchronize the different cosmologies of the world religions, if you want to call it that. Would that be fair?
And having done that, I inadvertently created the tool I needed to be able to write the next book, which is about ancient China, where a lot of evidence doesn't actually exist to compare to.
Mm-hmm.
So it's interesting. I'm sort of building the tools I need as I go along. Now, another thing that I discovered as I went along is that many of the Egyptian glyphs take the same shape as Dogon drawings, cosmological drawings.
Right.
Now, the Dogon don't have a written language.
Yeah.
So that means that these drawings, these cosmological drawings, existed before written language. It's not thinkable that the Dogon forgot their written language.
Do they keep the drawings somewhere, or do they draw them in the sand if you're asked to relate them?
They draw them in the sand if they're asked to later. As a matter of fact, the Dogon priests say, and I've observed this myself, that you can't really talk about the subject without drawing the picture.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I noticed that there were 30-some shapes that were obviously seemed to have a relationship between the Dogon cosmology and the Egyptian hieroglyphic language, and I knew what the Dogon shape represented. So I thought, if I could find some Egyptian words that were very simple words, it didn't involve very many glyphs, and that those glyphs centered on these shapes that I knew what they meant, I might be able to learn something about the Egyptian words.
Mm-hmm.
And in a perfect world, where I would have started would have been the Egyptian word for week. The Egyptian word for week is written with two hieroglyphs, two glyphs.
Mm-hmm.
The first one is a circle with the dot in the center, which is the sun glyph. It could represent the sun, or it can represent the concept of a day, or it is used in words that relate to periods of time. And the second glyph is an upside-down U that is the Egyptian number 10. And so I looked at that word, I looked at the form of the word, and I said, this word says 10 days.
Mm-hmm.
And then I did some research and discovered that the Egyptians had a 10-day week.
10-day week, that's correct, yeah, I know that.
I thought, amazing, I've just learned a fact about ancient Egypt I didn't know.
Simply by following the symbology.
Yeah, simply by looking at the form of the word. So then I asked myself, if one word works this way, what's the possibility that other words of cosmology also work this way? Mm-hmm. And with a little bit of research, I discovered that they all work that way. I started with words that relate to periods of time, and I found that the word for month reads, the moon makes an orbit.
Right, right.
And the word for seasons reads, 3 arcs of the Earth's orbit around the sun. Now, I said 3 arcs. Shouldn't there be 4 seasons? I went and I did some research and discovered the Egyptians only observed 3 seasons. They had a planting season, a harvest season, and a rainy season. So again, I learned something about ancient Egypt from the form of the word that I didn't previously know was true.
So there's the proof of your own research in the research, really, Larry, yeah?
Yes, it's a very good affirmation that I'm on the right track.
That you're on the right track, yeah. An affirmation that what you're doing is right, and it's solid, basically. You can stand on it, yeah?
And now you go the next level, and you discover that there are certain Egyptian words that include a trailing glyph that doesn't get pronounced. And
right.
The Egyptologists, usually that shape has something to do with the meaning of the word, but the Egyptologists aren't sure why it's there. They say that it's drawn into the word for emphasis. Mm-hmm. But I could see that if you substitute concepts for symbols, you in an Egyptian word, you create a symbolic sentence, that in those words, the symbolic sentence gave you a definition of what that trailing glyph means.
Mm-hmm.
And so from there, I could take the 4,000 Egyptian glyphs and lay out definitions for pretty much anyone I wanted to, based on the authority of the Egyptian hieroglyphic language itself, not based on what some Dogon priest says or based on what I think it means. Here I've got an Egyptian word that tells me what that glyph means.
Sure. You know, and I think that's some of the most important thing that you do, Laird, is that you started off with Dogon and symbology and trying to look at a mystery, and you've gone on this journey, and it's almost been an investigative procedure that, you know, you're reaping the dividends as you go, and then you're in Egypt now, and you're kind of putting another level of meaning to symbology there, and, you know, it's got a wealth of importance to it, I guess, I'm trying to convey, Laird.
Well, it does, and again, it transforms a tool for me, because what started out as an Egyptian dictionary, once you realize that each word is a symbolic sentence, it really becomes an encyclopedia.
Yes.
If I want to know what a concept means, if I'm presented with a new concept I don't understand about ancient culture, the first thing I do is I look at the Egyptian dictionary, the Dogon dictionary, and the resources I have on Buddhism, and try to get an understanding among the three, a consensus among the three as to what this concept represents.
Mm-hmm.
And if they're all in agreement with one another, then I'm on very firm ground to put forward an interpretation.
So fascinating, you know, and you know, it's like I kind of think back again to Germain and Deidre, and if they hadn't have gone to the Dogon at that time, and you know, we wouldn't be sitting here having this conversation or insight into this complex societal structure that they have, and science. It's such a complex science that they have. It really, I can't say that enough, probably for the listeners, you know, that these guys are talking about very complex scientific things that you cannot deny. And if you look at what they're talking about, it all relates to each other. It's not just one random thing here and there. Yeah?
Yes, that's true. And it's clear to me that the French anthropologists understood what they were onto, even though they didn't have the means to prove it. Because in 1956, the science hadn't progressed far enough to be able to verify any of the symbols.
Let's put it in context. The quantum physics came about not even, probably they set down the rules in, what, I think 1929, something like that?
Yes, string theory I don't think was published until 1980.
Yeah, so that's later, but just basically the quantum was 1930s, and that's only when they got together to hammer out a few ideas. It took a while to grow. They were still discovering stuff in modern quantum theory as late as 1980. It's the last development, but yeah, I mean, string theory is quite recent too, yeah, and I guess DNA research as well. Walter Crick, when did he discover the DNA molecule? That was the 50s, wasn't it?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, and that's something we haven't even got into, was their DNA structure and their biological analysis. Like, I mean, it's very complex scientific ideas. Like, it's a science. It's a complex science these guys are talking about.
Yes. Now you look at the esoteric tradition we were talking about.
Yeah.
Where any tribesperson can ask a question and expect to learn the innermost secrets of the tradition if they keep pushing.
Yeah.
So now, clearly the esoteric tradition was not there to prevent the Dogon tribes people from learning these things, because they have a right to learn it.
Mm-hmm.
So who was the secret? Why was there secrecy? Who was it being kept a secret from?
Yeah, I wondered that, you know, and it's like, is it a preservation for mankind in case it gets corrupted, or was it a mystery school for the elite? That's what I'm thinking.
See, what I see is, the implication to me is that there were at least two groups involved here.
Right.
And that one group was delegated by another group to help raise us up from the level of hunter-gatherers to farmers.
Mm-hmm.
And they were charged with giving us a creation tradition as part of that process.
Right. Is this the 8 ancestors that you talk about? The 8 ancestors civilizing us with a program?
That's right. That this cosmology is associated with a civilizing plan that involves specific skills that you see all over the world. Mm-hmm. The first place you see them appearing is Göbekli Tepe.
Yeah.
Now, in Göbekli Tepe, you have these megalithic structures that a few thousand years later, you notice someone deliberately buried. And they buried it in a loving way so that nothing was destroyed or disturbed, but it was hidden.
Right.
Hidden from someone.
carefully planted almost, yeah, for the discovery at a later date.
So my feeling is that this group that came to teach us these things, who it appears to me had our very best interests at heart and didn't pull any punches when it came to giving us the straight truth about things, were prohibited by whoever delegated them from giving us science.
Right. I got you.
So they created this esoteric tradition so that they could provide us with the science, but protect themselves from being discovered that they had given it to us.
I think their brain levels were working very high to do all that. What an arduous task to encode information with symbology. It's such, but then again, I mean, we're talking a highly intellectual group of beings to do this.
But actually, it's not as complicated as all that, because what I found is that the cultures that did the best job of preserving this stuff were the ones who never evolved writing.
Yeah, the oral cultures, yeah.
These are mnemonic symbols. Now, when my children were very young, before they could read or write, we were concerned if we took them out to a county fair, what would happen if we became separated from our child and they were not able to communicate to somebody where they lived or what their phone number was? How would we ever find them? And so my wife and I decided to teach our children to sing their address and their phone number to the tune of children's songs.
Very good.
Now,
very clever.
Any friend or family member who has ever heard us sing the song one time remembers our address and our phone number. So this is not a complicated way of learning. This is a very effective, simple way of learning.
Yeah, I got some memory techniques like that too, where I need to remember something, and probably not sing it, but I mean, I remember stupid ideology, to apply to some large number or fact or something that I need to remember. Yeah, it's like a memory technique, I guess. Yeah.
Yes, I don't know if you are familiar with a television sitcom called Cheers.
Cheers, yes.
Okay, now there was an episode of Cheers where the coach was trying to teach Sam, the bartender, some things he needed to know before taking a history test or a geography test.
Right.
And so he was studying about Albania. Yeah. And so he put geographical facts about Albania to the tune of When the Saints Go Marching In. Now, anyone who saw that episode one time, now has in their brain all of these geographical facts about Albania that I still remember.
It's something that's a good lesson we could learn, Lara, different ways to remember, because I think, in school, just on a personal note, people go to school now and they just get bombarded with these textbooks that are like daunting. They're just daunting for children, and if you don't get it that way, it's the highway. Yeah,
That's right.
That is a sad way that we've developed, I think.
Now, the Dogon realized, or whoever put this creation tradition together realized, that if each subject you teach reinforces the previous subjects you taught, then every effort you make is only multiplying what you get out of it. And so I've actually been very pleased to see over the course of 25 years that every time it occurs to me, gee, this system would be so much simpler for me if I were the one developing it. If the person had thought to put two meanings with every word, or if there have got to be 24 different things that I thought of that, gee, I wish someone had thought to do. And when I go look, they did it.
Yeah. Fascinating.
And it's all designed to help us make this very complex system easy to understand.
Sure. I'm just thinking of the guy there, Daniel Tammet. He's got Asperger's. He's slightly autistic, but he's remembered the value of pi to 22,500 places. But he has the numbers 1 to 800 encoded in his head, and for each number he associates it with a shape and a smell, and he can interlock numbers together. Very complex. Amazing. Yeah, you should look that guy up, Lara. Daniel Tammet. He learned Icelandic language in 2.5 weeks. Yeah, he can learn languages too. Yeah, but he's like, it's not that he's autistic either. It's just the methodology is there. Yeah, and he uses symbology in his mind. He doesn't even have to write it down. The symbology is in his head, and I just think that's the side of the brain we don't use, I guess, Lara. Yeah, is what I'm trying to correlate there.
And I think you're right, and you see that. Modern society is sort of evolving that way, that we've moved away from, we have our are written words that are phonetically written.
Yeah.
But more and more we see acronyms.
Yeah.
And the acronyms are doing essentially what the Egyptian hieroglyphic language does. They're taking a single symbol or a single letter to represent an entire word or concept.
Sure. Just
And
take
so,
the word laser, for example. I don't think anybody on the street could tell you what the word laser means, but it's a 5-letter sentence to explain the stimulated emission of electrons, basically. But everybody knows what a laser is. They know what it looks like and they know what it does. But that acronym LASER is a scientific term, basically. So yes, exactly.
And so more and more as we become more scientifically capable, that's the way that we tend to move.
I think we're going back to our roots, in one way, Laird.
Yes, I think we are.
Sure.
So
Okay, Laird, look, we could talk forever about Dogon. I think it's just fascinating. The science is just so fascinating. And, I've actually committed myself today. I'm going to actually trace some of the sources of. I want to read the Pale Fox and some of the Germain and Dietrich and stuff because you do give some quoted text and excerpts in the book, and your wealth of material in there, and you've really put your own stamp and your own unique way in it. But you did it you documented your investigation basically. So I welcome the listeners to get out and buy your work, and just give us out your website there, Laird, before we go on. I want to mention your last book, The Velikovsky Heresies, but before we go, just give us your website there, Laird.
And actually, I don't have an official website. There is a www.lairdscranton.com that does reference my work, that I have not really authorized, but as long as someone wanted to put it together, I'm pleased that they did.
Really? That's strange.
They can go to innertraditions.com, which is my publisher,
Mm-hmm.
and their a page there with references to my books. And those are probably the best places to find me. I'm on Facebook also.
Sure. So you go to your publisher, you can get the books, the Inner Traditions, and they do a lot of mystery seeking, alternative history, and science. I think a few of my guests on the show have been with Inner Traditions. So
yes, they actually have two imprints. One is innertraditions.com, and the second is Bear and Company.
Very good. Yeah, I think it was Chris Dunn from the Giza Power Plant. He's with Inner Traditions, I believe.
Yes, I believe he is too.
Yeah. Okay, so I just wanted to get on with your latest work, The Velikovsky Heresies. I know you're in the middle of another book at the moment, Laird, and that's going to be coming out soon, so that's just to whet the appetite for the listeners. But why the shift then, giving so much Dogon research? Because that was quite a chunk of your life to do that now, Laird, let's be honest. That's not,
yes.
and I can understand why. It's not something you want to go, anybody will just jump in on a weekend like. But why the shift?
You were talking about wanting to get to certain books that you intend to read.
Yeah.
Well, it's the same way, I'm sure, for any author, that I've got a list as long as my arm of books that someone would like me to read or I would really like to read, but it's hard to get past what I need to read for the next thing that I'm writing.
Yeah. I guess that's the thing about being an avid book reader, and I guess having a few different subject matter that you like. I like everything. I mean, I like history, science, ancient cultures, civilizations, so that's just a big chunk there. Like, I mean, that's just too much of the spectrum, I guess, like, but, I'll never read all I want to do. I wish sometimes I could do the Matrix and just put the spike in the back of the neck and just learn the books. Like, I don't want to learn martial arts or anything action or learn to fly a helicopter. I just want to read the book within a second or two.
That's right.
Why the shift to the Velikovsky Heresies then? Tell me about that, Laird.
I went to high school in Portland, Oregon.
Sure.
Now, Oregon is to the United States like New Zealand is to the world.
Right.
Okay, and Oregon was a very interesting place to grow up and to be a student. Well, Portland happened to be a hotbed of support for Immanuel Velikovsky. Immanuel Velikovsky was back in the 1950s was a close colleague and friend of Albert Einstein's.
Sure.
Now, in 1950, Velikovsky wrote a very controversial book called Worlds in Collision, in which, based on research he had done on ancient references and texts and myths and so forth, had concluded that the planet Venus had to be a relatively new addition to our solar system, that it couldn't be billions of years old, it could only be thousands of years old.
Mm-hmm.
And this book became a wild bestseller, and there was lots of debate, and Portland was one of the centers of debate. And so I had for a long period of my life, had it in the back of my mind to try to write a book about Velikovsky.
Right.
Well, a few years back, I realized that we had quite a bit new research done in astronomy. We had the Venus Explorer spacecraft go to Venus, Mars Explorer. We had missions to Jupiter. We had missions to comets. And that there was quite a body of new material here that didn't exist when Velikovsky wrote that had bearing on his theory, and that this might be an opportune time to take a look at that material and see how Velikovsky held up in terms of the new science.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wrote to my publisher and said, I think I'd like to take a short break from the cosmology and write a book about Velikovsky. Would you be interested? And they said, actually, we wanted to publish a book on Velikovsky for years, but didn't have one to publish.
Really?
So
fascinating.
So I stopped and figured I could take 9 months or a year and produce this book. I didn't know going into it whether what I was going to find was going to uphold Velikovsky or refute him.
Right.
But I had the sense that there should be some single fact I could hit upon that would be the turning point for the controversy about whether he could be right or not.
Sure. The intrigue and the interest is there, but you also see that could be proven one way or another. There could be evidence contrary to the facts, or it could be, again, to back up the facts, yeah?
That's right. And in Velikovsky's scenario, and again, this is based on ancient evidence. Velikovsky was a historian, and he was a psychiatrist,
yeah.
And he was educated across a broad range of fields, and he took the liberty of crossing the boundaries of those fields in his theories. Mm-hmm. He was trying to use ancient myths to support an astronomical theory, which astronomers hated.
Sure. Yeah, it's just, you mentioned, Carl Sagan argued against Velikovsky, but you also mentioned him for the Dogon as well.
That's right. And he played the same role.
Was Carl Sagan given that as a title or a job by the mainstream? Was he having to stand there as the front man for these people, basically?
Well, I think because Sagan was such a good spokesperson and popularizer of science,
right, that
he was the logical person to step up and make a statement that would refute something that the scientific world wanted to speak against.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But
he was given the duty then, yeah.
Yes, Sagan took basically the same role in terms of Velikovsky that he took in terms of the Dogon. He was the person who, working from presumed scientific knowledge, would present logical sounding reasons why the theory had to be wrong.
Right. Okay, so give us the thesis, the Velikovsky thesis, condensed succinctly, just the solar system model that because he kind of had a little solar system model built up, and true logic though, not fanciful. This is true logic of applying mythology and history.
Yes. Well, Velikovsky worked very much the way that I do. You were talking about, you and I were talking before the show started here about people who are computer programmers having a set of skills that apply themselves to mysteries.
Yeah.
Well, Velikovsky had a very similar set of skills, and one of the differences I see in approach is that when a scientist or a mathematician is faced with a theory, if there's a 3% chance that it's wrong, they typically will not sign off on that theory. They don't pursue it necessarily.
Sure.
Whereas a programmer, if he has an approach that looks like it's 60% right, will pursue it.
Yeah, it's funny. There's an imbalance there, but I think that could be a good thing in terms of the people outside science. Because I think you said before that that a lot of the discoveries are coming from outside science, probably for that reason. Statistically, the alternative scientists are the ones chasing the ideas and coming up with fruition now. Yeah,
the statistic I've heard is that these days most of the game-changing discoveries that are being made in any scientific field are being made by people outside their field.
Mm-hmm.
But Velikovsky's theory about Venus was, and this is based on what ancient myths and texts had to say, was that Venus was ejected from Jupiter by another body that collided into Jupiter. And that Venus started its life as a comet, a very brilliant comet that could be seen in the sky during the daytime like the moon or the sun, mm-hmm. and was classed by many cultures as alongside the moon and the sun rather than with the planets because nobody could tell that it was a planet. It looked like a comet, or it looked like something larger than a comet that was competitive with the sun and the moon.
Right.
So Velikovsky says that Venus made its way through the plane of our solar system. It was in the same plane as the planets and ended up making a direct impact on Mars and created a lot of the damage that we find on Mars. That it eventually made its way to a close encounter with the Earth and created a lot of global cataclysmic effects similar to what were reported at the Exodus from Egypt, the great 10 plagues of Egypt, the event that was the end of the Minoan Empire and the end of the Middle Kingdom in Egypt.
That would be tidal waves and volcanic. Would that be right?
It includes many things, many eruptions of volcanoes, hails of stones, hot glowing stones from the sky, water turning to blood or appearing to turn to blood.
Red tide.
Many different effects. People getting boils on their skins and so forth. A lot of the effects that are described in the 10 plagues are natural consequences of volcanic eruptions. They've documented similar things happening. Say when Mount Helens erupted, people downwind got boils on their skin. And they've seen that if the right minerals are in the what's ejected from the volcano in the dust, that it can change the color of a river or a lake.
Sure. So when Velikovsky said that Venus was he belched out of Jupiter or ejected from Jupiter, did he come up with that because he needed Venus to come from somewhere, or was there a reason for that?
No, that basically comes from Greek mythology, where Athena, who by one set of myths can represent Venus, was ejected from the head of Zeus, who represents Jupiter.
Jupiter, yeah.
But there are other cultures around the world who say the same thing in terms of their own mythologies. According to the Greek tradition, there was a goddess named Metis who was prophesied to give birth to a child who was going to be greater than Jupiter. And so Jupiter swallowed Metis and then shortly thereafter gave birth to Venus.
Right. So Velikovsky is using the mythology as a parable for astronomy and the events that have happened in their past, hypothetically, let's say that. He's compiling some logical perception of what may have happened. Surely he has to form like a solar system model. Is that what I'm going with this? Is that what he was trying to do? Follow some sort of an early solar system model?
No, he had come across a papyrus during his research for a historical book he was trying to write. He was at Columbia University in New York and had come across a papyrus that seemed to describe the events of the Exodus from Egypt, the 10 plagues.
Right.
And so that surprised him. It made him think there might be a historical basis to that event, but he could see if there were, it would have to have been a global event, not a local event. Mm-hmm. And so he began, since he was in the library that had provided access to all these ancient cultural texts, he began researching what other cultures about the same period of time had to say and discovered that they all say the same thing. They all described the same kinds of upheaval, and they all ascribed the upheaval to a comet. Right. But what was interesting is that the name each of these cultures gave to their comet, even though it was different from culture to culture, was the same name that they eventually gave to Venus.
Right. Fascinating.
Also, if you go back far enough, like into the Sumerian culture and so forth, the earliest symbols used to represent Venus look like comets. They're drawn to look like comets. And all of the earliest terminology in ancient texts that describe Venus use terms that are typically reserved for comets. Mm-hmm. So Velikovsky decided that Venus had been the comet that created this upheaval, and that it eventually settled down to become a planet, which means that Venus is a young body. And then from there, he started making some very logical conclusions, drawing some conclusions. He said, if Venus is a new body, then when we get there, we're going to discover that it's very hot.
Sure.
Because that hasn't had time to cool down.
This is where some of the proof comes in, which then expels any other kind of repudiation for this guy. You know, he's on it, like, and he's making statements that are going to start getting corroborated, and this is an ongoing saga for a long time now.
It is almost 60 years. But now, at the time, in the 1950s, there were scientists writing that Venus ought to be very Earth-like, and we should be able to colonize it. But when we got there, we discovered that the surface is hot enough to melt lead.
Sure. Now, they have that down to a runaway greenhouse effect, but I don't get that. I never got that, like.
Well, I never really got that either. And there are many different kinds of technical arguments that are made against Velikovsky. For example, they'll say, well, look, Velikovsky didn't predict an actual temperature, so it doesn't count that he predicted that Venus was going to be hot.
Yeah, but he predicted everything else, so that's just like a little loophole for you to explain away, you know.
And he says if Venus wasn't formed like the other planets, then when we get there, we should discover that it has an abnormal rotation and revolution.
Which it does, yes. Which it does, yeah.
Since magnetic fields develop over time, that if Venus is a young planet, we shouldn't find that it has much of a magnetic field, which it doesn't.
Sure, and it's slowing down Venus as well. Venus is slowing down as well.
Yes, which is actually an indication that there are forces acting on Venus that we don't understand.
Yeah.
So there are lots of different arguments that were made against Velikovsky, but he was hugely controversial, sold many, many, many books, and leading astronomers from Harvard University organized a boycott of his publisher. They boycotted the textbook division of Velikovsky's publisher in order to get them to cancel the book.
Sure, I'm glad you brought that up, because just for the listeners that don't know Velikovsky, I mean, Velikovsky was hated in his day. I mean, I think they would have appreciated Satan more than Velikovsky.
Yes, he's considered the crackpot's crackpot. He was persona non grata for several decades.
Yeah. But didn't Einstein back him up somewhat?
Not really. Einstein, like a lot of the other scientists, even close friends of Velikovsky's, supported him in kind of a distant way.
They were their hands were tied. Yeah, their hands were tied, but he did. What was the thing about Jupiter where they discovered that Jupiter had electromagnetic radio waves coming from it? Yes,
well, one of the considerations of Velikovsky's was he felt that electromagnetism played an unrecognized role in the interactions of the bodies of the solar system. Mm-hmm. And because of that, he predicted that, as just a natural consequence of that concept, that radio emissions would be found to be coming from Jupiter if they would just look. And he asked Einstein to please authorize on his authority a search for those radio waves, and Einstein politely declined.
Right.
But then a year or so later, two astronomers who were studying some entirely other issue relating to Jupiter happened to discover radio waves coming from Jupiter, and Einstein reversed himself. He asked his secretary, his appointment secretary, to authorize any test Velikovsky wanted in Einstein's name. But unfortunately, Einstein died.
At least that was something, though.
Yeah, that was something. But several days later, Einstein died of a brain aneurysm.
Oh, right.
So that didn't go very far. But so there's a debate as to whether Einstein really supported Velikovsky or not. The truth of the matter is they were longtime friends. They had been involved in many different projects together over the years. They were colleagues at Princeton. They used to take long walks at night discussing the projects they were working on. And there's a rumor that Velikovsky's book was the book open on Einstein's desk the night he died.
Sure. See, I haven't actually read the original works of Immanuel Velikovsky, Worlds and Collisions. I know the story and I know the saga that, you know, if you mention his name now, you'd just be shunned in the astronomy community. Still to this day, like, you know, he's hated. Yes. Like, I mean, he's hated for his ideas because it contradicts everything.
And the problem is that over the period of the last 60 years, every so often, some new fact is discovered that actually is supportive of what Velikovsky says.
Sure.
And anytime one of those facts turns up, you'll see that the scientific world makes the announcement hand in hand with the announcement of some new theory that had never been proposed before, whose net effect is to distance it from Velikovsky. For example, they recently found on Venus, in the atmosphere of Venus, a radical called hydroxyl.
Right.
Now, hydroxyl, according to the NASA article that came out announcing the discovery, is a molecule that is sometimes found around comets.
Right.
But if you dig a little deeper and look at some other sources, you discover that hydroxyl is the most abundant radical in a comet's atmosphere.
So they've dressed the evidence up a little bit better to suit themselves.
Yes, they minimize the evidence to try to distance it. And this happens again and again and again.
Yeah. And then
so I was looking for it at each of the stages of Velikovsky's scenario here. I was looking for any fact that would turn the controversy. And what I discovered was that at each phase of the controversy, there are half a dozen or so considerations that have to be explained away by these ad hoc theories.
Yeah.
If Velikovsky's wrong.
Yeah.
But they would go away automatically based on a single cause if he were right.
Which is strange because, like, you mean, that's if you got one thing that cancels out everything, that's probably what you're going to be looking at and agreeing with. But that's not what this acceptance hasn't become as a result.
No, it hasn't. And it's not just the half a dozen considerations at that specific phase that go away if Velikovsky's right. All of the considerations at every phase disappear. They evaporate if Velikovsky's right.
Sure.
And
the list is growing like now, isn't it? It's like...
Oh, it is. It's growing tremendously, and they're getting harder and harder
to disprove. Yeah, and I mean, it's time wasn't on Velikovsky's side. That's the problem. I mean, he was ahead of his time in terms of what he was coming out with. You know, regardless of whether you want to say the guy is right or wrong, regardless of whether you subscribe to astronomy or you subscribe to mainstream astronomy or you subscribe to the Velikovsky thesis, regardless of what that is, time was not on the side. And I mean, modern astronomy had to catch up. We're now at that stage, I guess, 60-year saga now. You know, I think they've kind of NASA astronomy run whatever. I mean, they've kind of won in a way. They've dispelled the guy before it could be proven. Like,
that's right, and it was a very interesting process to study. One of the considerations after Venus hit Mars, according to Velikovsky. Mm-hmm. There was a close encounter between Mars and the Earth also around 750 BC. Mm-hmm. And there's some very interesting effects that happened to our planet around 750 BC that are not yet explained.
Right.
One of the obvious effects is that nearly every ancient culture that had a 360-day year for thousands of years suddenly changed to a 365-day year, all of the same short moment of history.
Sure, which is where we get our 60 degrees, 60 minutes, 360 degrees in the circle, all that.
Right. So one of the points I wanted to pin down was I knew that if I could find an absolute fact that could not be refuted, that the Egyptians had a 365-day year in ancient times, as is the traditional belief, that Velikovsky would have to be wrong about at least that one point. And so I went to my friend John Anthony West, and I said, I know that you're in contact with scholars who are authorities on the Egyptian calendar. Could you please ask them all for me for a single irrefutable fact that says that Egypt had to have a 365-day year in ancient times? Mm-hmm. Well, as it turns out, there isn't one. That what happens is they found an engraving on a stela that indicates that the Egyptian year began with the rising of Sirius, the heliacal rising of Sirius. Mm-hmm. Now, what this means is, if you have a year that goes from that kind of an astronomical event back to that kind of event again, it's a solar year.
Yeah.
Okay. They assumed that meant it was a 365-day year.
Yeah, but that was an assumption made, yeah.
Turns out all of the references in ancient Egypt aren't given in terms of an absolute count of days. They are usually given in terms of a number of months and a number of days.
Right.
While in Egypt, they had two calendars. They had a lunar calendar, and the Dogon have these same calendars. They had a lunar calendar that was 355 days long, including a leap year day, and a solar calendar that they think was 365 days long. And they had what's called a civic calendar that was 360 days long. And the Egyptologists say that the 5 intercalary days, the leap year days that they have in Egypt, were used to reconcile that civic calendar of 360 days to the solar calendar of 365 days.
Mm-hmm.
But because the month names are the same in the lunar calendar and the solar calendar, there's no reference you can look at that isn't ambiguous. It could be describing a reconciliation between the 355-day lunar year and the 360-day civic year, which in fact at that point in time may have been the actual solar year.
Sure.
Now, if you look at other cultures that did the same thing, they were always reconciling their lunar calendar to that 360-day calendar, not to other calendars. And every reference we have to a 365-day calendar, like in China, there's no documentation for it until well after 750 BC.
Fascinating.
So the bottom line is that I couldn't prove absolutely one way or another. The best I could show was, do you know the game Clue? There's a board game called Clue.
Where
a murder is committed.
Cluedo, we call it in the UK. Cluedo, we call it here.
Okay. And there's a mansion, and a murder is committed in a particular room with a particular weapon by a particular character.
You got 6 people, 6 weapons, 6 rooms, yeah?
Right. And so on each player's turn, he presents a theory secretly to another player using cards that suggests that a particular player with a particular weapon and a particular room were involved in the murder.
Mm-hmm.
And the other player has to disprove it or not based on cards they have in their hand.
Sure.
Okay, well, in this case, the way I look at the calendar issue, as with a lot of Velikovsky issues, is that the best I can say is that I can't disprove him. I can't prove him wrong.
Right.
So I compare it to the process of vetting suspects for a murder in a murder trial, in a murder case investigation. That you bring the guy in and you say, now where were you between the hours of 8 and 9 o'clock last night? And if he can tell you convincingly where he was and who he was with, then you don't have to prosecute him.
I can only say it's a pity that the astronomers didn't take that same approach to try to disprove him wrong. But it's like you say, Lard, it takes somebody outside the field. I kind of wonder why these guys hated him so much. I don't know whether it was because he was a non-astronomer, or was it because of the theories, or was it both? I actually think it was because he was a non-astronomer, and it was.
Well, it was partly that, but there were bigger stakes being wagered here. The problem is that Velikovsky's theory looked like it was trying to resurrect a kind of fire and brimstone religion that the scientists have been trying to dispel for a couple of centuries.
And Velikovsky was Jewish. Not that I'm anti-religious in any way.
Yes, he helped found the Hebrew University with Einstein.
Yes, exactly. I know that much. So did they use that against him? Did they say you were trying to go down a religious route or change a paradigm or?
Not overtly, but then there's another problem here that Velikovsky is saying that processes that the scientists believe should take billions of years can happen on much, much, much shorter time frames, and that knocks the support out from underneath Darwinism.
Sure.
And so there was a lot at stake here in proving Velikovsky wrong. You can't admit that he's right because you're undermining the foundation of a lot of science.
Sure. I actually asked an astronomer before, did the asteroid belt come from a smashed planet? And I might as well have just slapped him in the face. And I didn't actually know. I was a student at the time. I wasn't even into Velikovsky. I wasn't asking that as maybe he's from a Velikovsky paradigm. He was older, all right.
They're very sensitive to these questions. Oh,
yeah, very sensitive, you know. But I might as well have just slapped them across the face. Yeah. I would have got a better response, probably.
Yes, because careers, if they want to have a career, they can't be seen to be supporting this stuff.
That's a shame.
This is a problem with science in general right now. Is my impression over the last 20-some years is that we're looking at a dual system of science in the world.
Very good way of putting that, Laird. Yeah, I mean, we have a dual system going on, and it doesn't seem right or fair. It's almost insanity. It's an insane way to do it.
It is. There seems to be the public image of what we're allowed to understand has been discovered, And then there's the real science going on behind the scenes that it seems to be far, far, far more advanced. For example, if you think that the amount of time between the Wright brothers' flight and the space shuttle is about the same amount of time as the time between the space shuttle and now, and you notice what a magnificent amount of advancement there was in the first period, and how there has been virtually no apparent advancement in science in the second period, somebody's not telling us the truth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. For sure, like. You know, I was thinking about the Einstein thing as well, because I know Einstein backed up the theory of Charles Hapgood. He endorsed Charles Hapgood on some of his work. I don't know if you're familiar with Charles Hapgood.
Yes, I am, but I have my own reasons for... I have an easy way to disprove Hapgood.
Right. I'm not too sure that's my point. I'm not too sure about Hapgood either. I know that he did a lot of work on ancient maps and stuff, but I know he was out there and he was alternative, and I know Einstein endorsed him. I just find it...
I like Hapgood quite a bit, but the fact that the Great Pyramid is still aligned
to true north, yes.
To true north says that we couldn't have had any slippage at all in the crust since it was built.
Yeah.
So that says to me that we might have had a change in tilt of axis of the Earth, which I believe has happened.
Yeah.
But I don't believe that we've had crustal shift.
Yeah, the crustal displacement thing doesn't it doesn't match with the Great Pyramid. Good angle on that, yeah, I like that, you know.
Also, if you look at Ice Age theory, you'll notice that places that you would expect to be glaciated at the same time, such as Northern Europe and Northern America, weren't. But instead what you find is points opposite on the pole glaciated at the same time.
Sure.
And that says to me that what we've had is a change in tilt of the axis of the Earth, not an ice age.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that also explains why we have great petrified forests in Antarctica where you don't have enough sunlight to grow a forest.
Fascinating. Yeah. Well, I guess what Velikovsky came out with was much more attacking to an existing paradigm than what basically Hapgood would have been coming out with anyway. I like
Hapgood. I read his book and I really enjoyed it, and he had a lot of very interesting things to say. As a matter of fact, I think Velikovsky quotes Hapgood in
is that right?
One of his books. Yes, I think he has a book called Ages in Chaos.
Yes, that's right. I've seen that title before. I'm going to pick up Velikovsky's work and get into the original source. I am going to do that, Larry. So look, Velikovsky probably, I don't think he probably knew, did he know the backlash he was going to come against? Did he realise what he was up against? Did he just release what he thought, and was he naive a bit like that? Or
I think he might have been. I mean, this is a man who had his own recognition in the world. He was a known person.
Right.
He had been involved in major projects, so he had enough personal clout to be able to induce a major publisher to publish his book.
Right, so he wasn't a nobody. He wasn't a nobody.
I have a hard time believing that he didn't realize that it was going to create controversy, but, you know, he might have been deliberately doing that to sell books. Who knows? But I know that he firmly believed in his theories and that he was sincere about that.
I mean, the tail of Venus, there's ions as well. I think you were talking about that before. There's ions coming off Venus that shows that it's got a tail like a comet as well now. That's another thing that's confirmed Velikovsky.
Yeah, Venus Express did a lot to reveal new information about Venus, and that is one of the things, the fact that we have an ion tail that not only extends out into space from Venus and gets stronger as Venus approaches the sun, like a comet's tail does, but that when Venus comes to its closest point in orbit with the Earth, first of all, Venus always faces its same side to the Earth, which is characteristic of them having come in close contact with one another. It's a resonance between the two planets, or an apparent resonance, and the tail extends out into space as far as the Earth and points directly at the Earth. So there's lots of reason to think that there may possibly have been a close approach between the two planets at some point.
See, I'm a humanitarian. I think about the persecution of the guy, and I feel sorry for him because, I'm an idealist. I like to think that if you got a good idea out there, you can put it there. But I know that that's not true. I know. I'm also a realist as well.
Yeah, yeah. You heard about Galileo, right?
Yeah, that's the thing. And I'd like to think that we've changed in this society. But like you say, I think we're having this dual system now, Laird. And I think science has replaced the church, if you know what I mean, as the opposing force. We got rid of the religion persecuting us in the 1600s, and we've just replaced it with science, a mainstream academic science, if you want to call it that.
Well, I think that any society is going to develop an entrenched set of people who have a position to protect and turf to defend, and you're going to get these kinds of conflicts no matter what kind of a society it is.
Sure. Just as something, I think you've induced a dual system of knowledge, just to throw it back to you. One is that there is evidence out there to explore, yeah, and then you can come up with answers there's research there to be done, yeah. Don't accept it, but there is other answers there, and you can probably not prove or disprove a theory, but you can certainly look towards something else and guide us in another direction,
I realized when I first began writing my books that many of the questions I was addressing are not things that you can prove or disprove.
Sure.
And so instead what I focused on was the concept of demonstrating something.
Yeah.
And the example I gave earlier of laying two passages side by side, it doesn't prove that the Dogon knew what they say they know, but it demonstrates that what they know looks like science.
Sure.
And so I satisfy myself with the attempt to demonstrate that a thing is likely to be true, and that's enough for me. I don't necessarily have to prove it absolutely.
Setting Velikovsky aside, right? Do you know what I think you've shown with the Velikovsky heresies? And indeed the original work. I think you've shown that planetary scientists, or astronomers, if you want to call them that, the branch of astronomers called planetary scientists, don't know all they need to know about our solar system. Quite the opposite. I think they know very little. If anything, I think it's mostly guesswork, based on a few facts that have no insight into anything. Yeah?
Well, another one of the academics that I've met through the conferences I speak at is an astronomer named Jeff Marcy from Berkeley in California, and he heads the search for Earth-like planets.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes, I know the guy, yes.
Okay, well, he wrote an article last year in which he stated that based on the evidence they have so far from these exosolar systems, he's convinced that neither of the two theories we have for planet formation can be right.
Really? Fascinating. You know what I mean? How planets form, there's problems about the moon, the metal cores. These are all problems that we don't know. There's the asteroid belts, and then the Venus has just got so many anomalies with it, it really has. It's just, there's a list of anomalies that, I think our solar system is very hard to figure out. I mean, they point their expensive telescopes at distant galaxies, and yes, you can learn about receding galaxies and speeds they fly apart and the Hubble constant. And yes, I agree with a lot of that. I'm not dispelling astronomy at all. I'm not. I just think our own local astronomy here, it's so difficult to prove, and it's so.
It is very difficult. Another example of the sort of thing I tried to find out as research for my book. Astronomers routinely say that Venus is billions of years old.
Right.
So I posed the question to a number of my sources, give me one irrefutable fact that states that Venus must be billions of years old. What is that based on? Surely we can boil it down to at least one clear fact. But the bottom line is there isn't a fact. You can look at Venus and notice that basalt exists on Venus, which takes several thousand years to form from volcanic eruption, from lava.
Mm-hmm.
But there's no granite, and granite takes millions of years to form. Or at least they haven't discovered it yet. So if they had positive evidence of granite on Venus, then Velikovsky would have to be flatly wrong. There are so many of these points where it's a single fail for Velikovsky, where if the single fact went against him, you could set aside most of his theory, and time again, you can't prove that fact.
Sure. Yeah, the astronomers are pulling their hair out really at the end of the day, and Velikovsky's not going away. I mean, he's long gone now, but he's not going away. His ideas, the effort by the NASA scientists, lads, to distance Velikovsky, is that an embarrassment to them? Is that the reason, or is it conspiratorial, or both, or what do you think?
Again, it's hard to say, but what I will tell you is that when I researched my book, let's back to the days when the only books we had were printed books.
Yeah.
If you were to write a book and publish it, as soon as it went into publication, it would be fair game for me to quote.
Yeah.
And I could cite that book and the date of publication and who the publisher was, and anybody who wanted could find a copy of that book and prove that what I had quoted was right. When it came to researching this book, I was favoring material that came from scientific sources and I wanted sources that had not been available to Velikovsky because I wanted to steer clear of anybody who had an axe to grind for or against him. And so a lot of my references came from NASA websites.
Right.
And oftentimes, every article that goes up on a NASA website goes through an extensive clearance process.
Oh yeah, that's right. It gets a lot of scrutiny before it goes up there.
It gets reviewed and cleared by numbers of personnel within NASA before it goes up. And oftentimes, once it goes on the NASA website, it's also republished by other groups, either on the web or elsewhere. So, in every case where I found a reference in a NASA article that I wanted to quote, if I could download a copy of the article, I did, but at least I would record the link to the article and quote as much of it as was pertinent to what I was studying as I could. Mm-hmm. Took careful notes and careful references, and I documented all of those references in the bibliography of my book. Mm-hmm. Well, when the editor at my publisher went through the manuscript and went through her process of verifying that what I was quoting was really what was on the website article, what she kept discovering was that either the article no longer existed, either on NASA's website or sometimes on half a dozen other websites too.
Really?
Or that the specific text that I was quoting had changed, or that the paragraph that I was quoting no longer existed in the article.
That doesn't look good now, does it?
No, it doesn't. So I actually had to put a disclaimer in the front of my book saying, look, folks, it's legitimate for me to quote it the minute they publish it. These are not just random things they're putting up. They've carefully thought about it before they put it on their website. It was fair game for me to quote. Mm-hmm. It's not fair game for them to change it with no trail of the fact and no evidence of the fact that they changed it.
Sure. There's another double standard that they have as well, and I don't get this, where, my research we were discussing before the show about Newgrange and all these ancient monuments that have these extremely accurate alignments, and astronomers we can look and date these monuments, and we look back and we go, yeah, they did this, they did that, they were really clever and they were really smart, and they have this really accurate alignment, but then, that stuff there that they're talking about and making references to and writing it down in books and stuff and literature, that's wrong. So
yes,
I don't understand where that works. It's okay when it suits them, and then they rubbish the stuff away as mythology. They made that up. They were making that little bit of...
It's the same thing with Velikovsky, that the same sources that the scientists are claiming are unreliable when Velikovsky quotes them, historians are routinely using to establish timelines of history.
It's crazy. It's an insane world we're in when this happens, Don.
For that matter, Venus. The atmosphere on Venus looks to me very much like a very early Archean atmosphere on the Earth. Mm-hmm. Now, the astronomers are denying that, but the climatologists make no bones about it. They routinely, I found one source that said, we found a time machine, and it's Venus.
Yeah.
That we can look at Venus and predict from what's there what the early atmosphere on the Earth probably looked like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and another thing I think they were saying that there should be smaller objects out there, but we do have smaller objects around Jupiter. We have the Io situation, which really isn't explained either.
Right. And we also have all of the short-term comets.
Yeah.
Now, the studies they did of the comets, they actually took some samples from a comet and brought the material back, or analyzed the material, and determined that there's what they call a real zoo of different materials that make up the comets they studied. Mm-hmm. Materials that had to have formed under very widely varying conditions, mm-hmm. But until that time, the theory had been that the comets formed during the primordial formation of the solar system. So that left them in a bad situation. How are they going to explain how material that had to have formed very close to the sun got intermixed with material that had to have formed very, very far away from the sun, and everything in between, and all wrapped up into one object?
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you look at the atmosphere of Venus or of Jupiter, Jupiter is considered to be a pristine sample of that original primordial solar cloud.
Yeah.
And so you have all the same material in the atmosphere of Jupiter that you have back then in ancient times. And as you go down through the descending levels of Jupiter with its gravity, you get widely varying conditions and widely varying types of materials being formed at different levels in the atmosphere. And you have these big swirling storms. The red-eye storm on Jupiter is probably 3 times the diameter of the Earth.
Mm-hmm.
So it reaches down to the center, they think to the center of the planet, and dredges material up to the top of the atmosphere. Right. So you could easily imagine that if a planet had been birthed through that opening,
yeah, that
these comets that they have been studying could have also been birthed at the same time.
Yep.
And that they might consist of an intermix of all sorts of different material that were cohesed together through the swirling of this storm.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. He really did open a can of worms, Lara, didn't he? You know, I mean, because there was knock-on effects to what his hypothesis, whether it was simple in its initiation, like it meant more things, complex procedures expelled from that.
Well, it all boils down to one person asking what they consider to be a naive question.
Yeah.
And following where that leads.
Sure.
And it's true in all the areas that you and I are involved with in study.
Mm-hmm.
There's so many questions to be asked, and so much room for someone to explore any one of those questions down to an answer that nobody else has really researched yet.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you know, I really commend you on your work to Velikovsky heresies, because that's something that really needed to be addressed in a more modern sense. You know, it's not that you're regurgitating material, quite the opposite. You've brought in new scientific data, you know, current, applied it to the model and really kind of enhanced the problem more than maybe, let's say that it's not resolved, but yet the problem's maybe more enhanced and it's not going away. I think the only thing that astronomy is going to do at the moment is just ignore it. Really, that's all they can do.
Yes, and the question is, at what point will a fact that is so glaringly obvious come to light that they can't cover up and they can't argue away?
Yeah, I'm just thinking about the water on the moon. The water on the moon discovery is another one as well.
Well, that is one of Velikovsky's predictions, and even his closest friend said to him, "Look, this time you're going to be wrong."
Really? Even his closest friend said to him, he must have been pulling his hair out, the poor guy.
Yeah, and as it turns out, he was absolutely right.
Sure. You know, and the thing is, this all came from logical conclusions on a thought-out process, Laird. You know.
Right. I mean, it's as I said, it's the same process I go through with my studies. That it's a qualitative exploration, not a quantitative one.
Sure. Was he happy in his own self that he did this, that he released the information? I guess he just followed the information and the data and see where it took him. I guess he didn't have much of a choice in the matter, but do you get any inkling that he was happy in what he did? And
well, he was very dedicated to, I mean, he never gave up on his theory. He always...
Good. He was true to the cause then. He was true to
the cause all the way to the end. He died in 1979, but he led a very unhappy existence for many of those years because he couldn't get speaking engagements and he couldn't get books published, and I mean, he was really persona non grata for a long time. They called him out of retirement in 1969 to be a TV commentator for the moon landings.
Really?
And to ask him to make certain predictions about what they were going to find when they landed on the moon. And his predictions turned out to be mostly correct. And the ones that aren't correct or arguably could be correct.
Yeah.
So he had a period of resurgence there where suddenly now he was getting invitations to colleges again and things like that.
Fascinating. Okay, look, Lara, we're going to wrap it up. We're well over the time, but what a fascinating discussion. Just give us out your website again there, Lara, before we go.
Okay, you can find my books at www.lairdscranton.com.
Yep.
Or at www.innertraditions.com.
Sure. And you can find you on Facebook there too as well, yeah?
That's right.
Sure. Well, look, Laird, it's been a pleasure having you on the show, and you're going to come back on and tell us about your new book when it's out this year. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Hopefully, I'll see it published by the end of this year, and I'll be back in contact with you maybe this time next year.
Yeah. Well, sure. You know, it's fascinating stuff that you churn out, and you know, it's just well thought out and studied and academic. I can't thank you enough for your books and your dedication to your research. I really can't, Laird. So it's been a pleasure having you on the show. Thank
you so much for inviting me on. This has been as much of a pleasure for me.
Oh, that's great, Laird. That's great to hear that. Thank you for coming on.
Thanks.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.
There you go. That was Laird Scranton. Such an interesting, down-to-earth guy. You know, he's really dissected the Dogon cosmology, the belief system, and the symbology, and he's come up with startling and controversial, yet albeit significant results. Above all, he's done all this by following the logic, and that's the key thing. And if you haven't checked out his work, please do so. You can find all our guests on the biography homepage at capricornradio.com, and Laird's work is at innertraditions.com if you want to check out his books. So that's all for now, folks. I have David Lewis Williams talking Neolithic structures on the 16th of February. I've got Maurice Cotterell on the 18th of February. And I've just confirmed Dr. Carmen Bolter for the 1st of March. So do stay tuned to your host, Mr. E.A. James Swagger on Capricorn Radio. Don't forget to check out the subscription, guys.
For a wide range of companies writing custom software, and then became interested in ancient mysteries when my wife gave me a book about various mysteries. Right.
Interesting. So you've really applied your computer software and programming skills for the symbology that we're going to talk about today with your Dogon material. Is that correct?
That's right. The computer background gave me a professional perspective from which I could see that I could recognize what look like design symbols as opposed to symbols that are just fortuitous.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, you've been able to dispel what's abstract. I think people think of the symbols that we're going to talk about as abstract and just fanciful or artistic, but there's quite a very defined, specific technical meaning to a lot of these, or you believe so anyway, which I think you portray.
Yes, I would say that one of the biggest detriments to a person who's doing research like I'm doing is their own wishfulness. Mm-hmm. And it's a problem how to protect yourself from your own wishfulness. And so when I work with interpretations of symbols or myths or whatever, I try to begin with explicit statements on the part of the culture that I've studied, so that I know that I'm on a firm ground. It's not that I want to believe that a symbol means such and such. I have at least one culture and one cross-confirming reference to show that in ancient times they considered these symbols to mean certain things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay, so look, we're going to talk about the Dogon today and their symbology, and it's quite a complex history/mythology. I don't know what to call it. I like to call it history because to the people of the Dogon in West Africa, it's history to them. It's their real living history. But a lot of people refer to it as their mythology, which I don't like to call it that. But so I guess just kind of maybe define the Dogon for us and a bit of their geographics and their history for us, Laird.
Okay, the Dogon are a modern-day African tribe involving approximately 300,000 individuals right now who are from Mali in Africa, which is in northwest Africa in the large bulge at the top of Africa. Mm-hmm. And they are a priestly tribe who deliberately located themselves far distant from other contacts. They live an 8-hour drive across desert from the nearest large civilized place. And their priests retain a very clear sense of what their symbols and their myths mean, which makes them a good group to work with. They also represent a kind of crossroads of several important ancient traditions. For example, they have rituals similar to Judaism. They wear skull caps and prayer shawls. They circumcise and they celebrate a jubilee year. but they also have civic traditions that are very similar to ancient Egypt. And they have a cosmology that's a very close match for ancient Buddhism. So all of this makes the Dogon a very interesting and fertile ground to explore for what the possible meanings of these myths and symbols might have been.
Sure. Just on a time frame,
Robert Temple's book made the Dogon very controversial because Temple was claiming that the Dogon evidence pointed to an alien contact.
Yeah.
And so suddenly the Dogon became controversial, and another team was sent to research the Dogon, a team of anthropologists headed by Belgian Walter van Beek.
Sure, I'm going to get into him a little later. I'm glad you brought him up. So, Germain and Dieterlen, they went there. They didn't just walk in there and were revealed all the secrets of the Dogon, basically. Then, if that's the case, if it was an esoteric mystery religion with initiates and asking the right questions, how come they got to know the knowledge, I suppose, Laird?
Well, first of all, it's a question of time. It's a lot like the stories you hear of Greek philosophers who spent 20 years in Egypt studying with priests. Mm-hmm. This is a 2-decade process that it takes to come up with this information. And Griol's nature was to ask penetrating questions. He wasn't satisfied not knowing. And so he would persist in asking the next question and following up on the previous question. And over a period of time, he finally reached a point where the questions he was asking were touching on secret aspects of the tradition. And one of the priests who was working with him, the Dogon priests, decided to check with a tribal council, because the rule of the Dogon tribe is that anyone who asks the question should get the answer, not just a tribe member.
Oh.
And so the priest went to the tribal council to say, now, the way I understand it here, anyone who asks is supposed to be answered. What about this French anthropologist? Mm-hmm. And the council said absolutely yes. If he's asking the question, he deserves the answer. And so they decided to initiate him as if he were a tribal member. As a matter of fact, when he died in 1956, he was given a burial as if he were a Dogon tribe member.
Really? Fascinating.
And he became an insider in the Dogon tradition.
Mm-hmm. So I guess his persistence paid off in the end, Dad.
Yes, considering that was what he wanted to learn about, his persistence did, but it was a very long process.
Right. Okay, so before we get into details of the astronomy stuff, and I know Robert Temple's work was controversial because he ran with the pink elephant in the room scenario, if you want to call it that, but this guy Walter van Beek, this guy, the Belgian guy that went in then did he go in with the attitude to disprove the Robert Temple book, or did he go in with preconceived notions? I'm trying to build a picture here, Laird. Did he go in with the same? Did he go in with the same approach as Germain or Dieterlen, perhaps? Then is that a better way?
That's very hard to say, and I don't know Van Beek personally, but I know that his background was as an ecologist. His background was not in ancient religion or in the anthropological study of religion. Right. So it seemed like an odd choice to have him head a team that was going in to restudy religion. The other odd thing is that it's fairly common in the anthropological world for a second anthropologist to restudy some aspect of another anthropologist's work. Right. But Van Beek was proposing to restudy the life's work of Marcel Griol, only he was only planning on spending a few years, devoting a few years' time to it.
Because I know there was Dogon masks that they're able to date. Is that correct? They found, or they have these Dogon masks that are made every, is it 50, 60 years?
That's right.
And they're able to add them up or something like that, Laird. I think that's what I'm getting at.
Yes, the Dogons celebrate an important festival that's related to the stars of Sirius. Right. They say every 60 years, but in fact, they find an excuse to celebrate it every 50 years. There's a deliberate obfuscation going on there to try to hide an important calculation in their tradition. Right.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I've had conflicting reports about the 60 and the 50, and that's why I said to you, was it 60? So, interesting.
Yes. Officially, the outward statement is it's every 60 years, but no individual in their tribe lives long enough to notice, that there have been more than two that are 50 years apart. If they see two in 50 years, they consider it an exception.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But yes, with every one of these festivals are called the Sigi Festival, Sigi.
Yeah.
They make a mask that gets put away in a cave for storage, and they can count these masks back many units of 50 years back, and so that gives them an idea of how long the Dogon tradition itself has been practiced.
Yeah, and that's just in the region in Western Africa, in the Mali region. Is that correct? Where they're at now?
That's right.
Right.
They live along a large escarpment in the desert. They eke out a very meager living, but they're also craftspeople and artisans who make they carve statues, and they make a living through their artwork also.
Yeah, I've seen some pictures of the escarpments, and it looks pretty gruesome where they're at, Larry.
Yes, it's pretty interesting. And these escarpments are filled with caves, and the caves are utilized as part of their ritual.
Right. Okay, so these guys are in Western Mali, and anybody that's going to do Dogon research, which not a lot of people will pick up the research that the two French anthropologists did, and you couldn't probably count it on your left hand a handful of authors that have really done this. So I guess what grabbed your attention first and foremost, and probably bring in the two French anthropologists, because that's where the research kind of starts for you, Laird, if that's right.
That's right. My wife in the early 1990s gave me a book called Unexplained by Jerome Clark.
Mm-hmm.
And this book consists of a number of chapters that each deal with an unresolved mystery in the world. And one of the chapters was devoted to the Dogon. And when I read it, the description was about a tribe that seemed to know some things about astronomy, and in particular about the stars of Sirius, that they shouldn't be able to know without the aid of modern telescopes. And so I thought, well, however this turns out, this looks like a very interesting area to look into. Mm-hmm. And I began following sources. I read Robert Temple's book called The Sirius Mystery, right. And I used his bibliography as a foothold into other resources to explore about the Dogon. Mm-hmm. Now, the main source is the study done by the French anthropologists Marcel Griol and Germaine Dieterlen, who studied and worked with the Dogon over a course of 30 years from 1930s through 1956, when Griol died suddenly. Sure. And that produced a number of articles and a couple of important books, including a final study on the Dogon religion called The Pale Fox.
Right.
And also Griol's daughter, Genevieve Calumet-Griol, who is also a well-respected French anthropologist in her own right. She's in her late 80s right now and lives in Paris, wrote the Dogon Dictionary, which is also a very important resource.
Yeah, that's something I hadn't come across till I read your work, that there was actually a Dogon dictionary, because I wondered how people could pick up the researches and were they just relying on books, but that must be very important for the Dogon. And indeed, the two French anthropologists, I mean, it's very important that they actually went and did that. They were living with them a long time, and that's so significant for that religion stroke mythology to survive, I think, Larry.
Yes, and at the time, Griol was the foremost, considered the foremost anthropologist in Europe. And he was very innovative about his techniques. He was the first person to use film as part of his study, his anthropological studies.
Oh, right.
So he was not just any run-of-the-mill anthropologist. He was a very well-known personage.
Yeah. Where's the footage at now, Laird? Have you seen any of that footage, or?
You can find some of it on on YouTube, and there are DVDs you can buy on the internet. In Search of the Pale Fox is one of the documentaries that was produced based on Griol's footage.
Right. Excellent. I'm going to look that up. So you mentioned the Sirius Mystery there, because I guess Robert Temple popularized the Sirius Mystery. You're a little bit older than me. I won't say how old, but I would have been a kid when that came out. But I mean, what impact did that have at the time when it came out, I think, Laird? Or was that largely kind of escaped the radar at the time, or?
No, actually, it was a very popular book. As a matter of fact, it was published by Inner Traditions, which is also my publisher.
Oh, that's your publisher, yes. I've seen that.
And for many years was the best-selling book they had. And part of the reason they acquired my my books was as a way of supporting the sales of that book.
All right, fascinating. Okay, so let's get into some of the. I want to throw out some of the Dogon material before we get into your interpretation and your research. Just give us a little bit of the creation story of the Dogon, I think, probably just for the listeners.
Okay, to give you some background,
yeah.
the Dogon have an esoteric tradition, a lot like many ancient cultures had, and there's very specific rules to this tradition. If I'm an initiate and you're a priest, and I ask you a question that is appropriate to my initiated status, you're required to give me a truthful answer. But if I ask you a question that is somehow inappropriate to my status, you're required either to remain silent or to lie if you have to in order to protect secrets of the tradition.
Right.
Now, Griol described this very clearly in his works, and it comes into play because a few years later, when after.
Hi everybody, and you're welcome to this edition of Capricorn Radio, broadcasting today from the town of Malmo in southern Sweden. Our aim here is to discuss topical science, ancient history, and historical mysteries in an effort to unveil our true cultural blueprint. If you haven't checked out our website yet, you can log on to capricornradio.com, and there you can subscribe for our show releases and news updates. You can also follow the links on the homepage for the YouTube channel and the subscriptions. All the shows will be archived there, and they're all accessible from the homepage, and feel free to get in touch. You know, I've been off the airwaves for a week or more now doing some travel research and writing, and I'm delighted to be back today with today's guest. I have a personal interest in the Dogon tribe, and today we'll be discussing the work of Laird Scranton. He has devoted a large chunk of his time to academic research of the Dogon. Laird Scranton is a software designer from Albany in New York, and he's the author of 2 books on African and Egyptian cosmology and language. His focus is on the study of comparative cosmology, which is the study of the classic myths, symbols, deities, cosmological concepts, rituals, and words of various ancient and modern cultures. He's also had a more recent book on the Velikovsky heresies, which I believe we're going to do a split show today on. So hour 1 will be on the Dogon and hour 2 on the Velikovsky heresies, all being well. So let's see, can we get our guest on the line? So I have with me now on the line Laird Scranton, author of a trilogy of books containing Dogon material and symbology. They are namely Science of the Dogon, Sacred Symbols of the Dogon, and the Cosmological Origins of Myth and Symbol. His latest work is also the Velikovsky heresies, which we're going to get into in the second half of the show. So without further delay, let's bring on our guest for today. Hi Laird, welcome to Capricorn Radio.
Hey James, thank you very much for having me on.
Well, it's my pleasure, Laird. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Is it Laird?
Yes, absolutely.
It's
that's
a very
right.
unusual name.
You're one of the few who gets it right.
Right. Okay. Well, I didn't want to mispronounce it because I know we've got some funny names over here too. So I've never come across a Laird before. So
actually, I've never come face to face with one either.
Really? Okay, look, having read your work, Laird, which I firstly commend you on, I really thoroughly enjoyed it, and thank you for writing those books because I got such pleasure out of them.
Well, thank you. Nice of you to say that.
Yeah, well, and again, look, I really see the unique skill set that you bring to the table, and I get people that are in the field of Egyptology or history or archaeology come on the show, and then I've got people that are outside, and the ones that are outside are the ones that are interesting because they bring a different skill set. But and it's okay for me because I've read your books. But just for the listeners, Laird, could you give us a bit about your background, your career, and tell us why this is important to the research that we're going to talk about today?
Okay, well, I had a very liberal education in Oregon on the west coast of the United States, and ended up being one of the first male co-eds at Vassar College, which was the first all-women's college in the United States. I then was trained to be a computer programmer at Vassar, and then became an independent software designer once I graduated college, and spent many years working for